There are only a few slides in this lecture, and it may appear really short, but I'm going to talk about some really rich pieces of what a researcher does in qualitative research, and hopefully give you a good understanding of that. There's a lot going on behind the scenes. When you read a research article, you have to kind of read between the lines and figure out all of the things that had to happen as the researcher set this up and planned it out and began the process of data collection. A qualitative researcher has to be very conscious of some of these behind the scenes aspects. Careful thought has to be given to setting up the data collection. You just can't walk into classrooms and start observing and then call it research and analyze it. One of the first decisions that has to be made is whether the researcher is going to be a participant in the actual events. If I'm observing how a teacher uses small groups during reading instruction, I can choose to sit back and simply record everything that I see, not participating in the instruction, not interrupting the class flow at all. And some researchers actually find this so important that they visit the classroom often enough that when they show up, the children just consider them part of the background and carry on as naturally as possible. So in that case, you want the researcher to be really detached from the ebb and flow of the classroom as much as possible. But other research involves the researcher as part of the group. And I've always considered myself part of the research, for example, when I run a focus group. It's very difficult to do a good job with a focus group unless you join right in and shape the conversation back to the research questions in mind and become part of the ebb and flow of the conversation. And it's very difficult to run a good focus group. Other really valuable research is done, for example, with teachers as participants right in their own classrooms as they record, they reflect, they analyze, they gather student samples of work, for example. And in that case, the researcher is providing incredibly valuable data as a researcher participant. So it totally depends on what the kind of question that you're trying to answer. And you have to make very careful decisions about what the role the researcher is going to play. The role of the researcher shapes how there will be access to the situation as well as the rapport that's built among the participants. It is really difficult to just walk into a classroom cold turkey and start observing what's going on because the setting and the context and what's happening in that classroom is so critically important to what's going on and what you're gathering. Even a detached observer does have some kind of rapport with the participants, whether it's acknowledged or not, and that has to be considered. I think of the qualitative research process as having 6 phases. You start with planning, based on the research problem, question, or statement, and grounded in a theoretical framework. You, a, a researcher who's doing qualitative research does a lot of footwork ahead of time and has to know the context that they're working in and what they should be looking for based on a framework. And then often, as you're doing the research, you're out there building your literature review and questioning what you see and researching as you go along. It's a very organic process. I know I keep coming back to that word, but it's incredible to participate in a really good qualitative research study. But when you're planning, you decide what you can collect. And a lot of times that is based on what the resources are that you've got. And you have to decide on the best types of things to analyze and what the sample will consist of. More on that later. And all of this is based on that research question you've got, but it's never enough. Your resources are always limited as to how much time you can spend observing and how many observers you've got and how many interviews you can gather and how much access you can even have to subjects. Next, you start the data collection by building rapport and gaining access. being very considerate of the participants and their availability. You want to work around the participants' schedules as much as possible, because remember how important that natural setting is. You don't want the teacher to set up something unnatural in the classroom for you to observe. So the researcher is the one who needs to adjust and mold their schedule around what's going on. As you start to collect the data, you almost simultaneously start analyzing and coding it, because that will determine what other data you collect. I I don't know of a single qualitative research project that didn't change as we planned it and we thought we knew what we were going to do, and then it kind of morphs. And then after you finish collecting the data, that's when the real heavy work starts. And often 90% of your time and energy can go into the data analysis part of this. It's very much more resource heavy than the other parts of the process. And then finally, you have to make decisions about what to present. What's going to be the most helpful pieces, and what can be left out, and what to put forth as an explanation. Let me talk you through a typical example. Suppose I want to see how the classroom culture changes when the school district provides iPads for middle school students. Classroom culture lends itself well to qualitative research, as it is a rich, complex construct. So I have my research problem or statement. I want to see how the classroom culture changes. I then have to plan what kinds of data I can collect. I decide that I need some kind of baseline so that I can describe any changes. So I want to survey students and teachers about typical classroom activities, especially those that are related to technology. I want to interview some teachers and students, and I want to do classroom observations. So I settle on a classroom observation protocol. I don't just send observers out there and say, tell me what happens. In this case, I find a protocol, and in the example I'm thinking of, I'm going to use a protocol that's known as the Technology Information Matrix Observation, which was developed and validated by researchers at the University of South Florida. So I've got this protocol that we're going to use. It's not willy-nilly observing everything. Now I'm ready to decide on my sample, and do the footwork for access and data collection. I decide to work through the principals and ask them to provide the names of one teacher at each grade level in the core subjects, because my resources are limited. I've got to start somewhere. And this way I can have consistency across the schools where these observations are happening. And we further decide that at the end of the year, I'm going to interview the teachers and a sample of their students, trying to determine if they can identify or they noticed any changes. And I decide to use the TIMO, that Technology Integration Matrix Observation, once a month in each teacher's classroom, so that I can hopefully see some change and document some change. So my next step is to gather some observers, because I can't do all of this myself. And it's better to have multiple sets of eyes anyway. And I'm going to send them out. And so I have to norm the observers with this protocol. We've got to get to the point where our inter-rater reliability is high enough that I feel comfortable turning them loose to do these observations I'm going to analyze. And using this particular protocol, they're going to be detached observers. They're just going to sit there and watch, and then they answer the questions on the protocol. So that they don't participate with the kids or interact with the teachers much at all. So they have to set up the schedules for the observations, and then the observations are done. Each month, I make a summary of what's happening. I analyze the summary of what these observers are bringing in to me, and I provide that to the teachers and the principals, as we want this to be as natural as possible, and we want the teachers to know that we're looking at classroom change. No surprises in this case. We're detached, but we want the teachers very aware of what we're looking for. At the end of the year, I conduct my interviews and get them transcribed. At that point, I decide to conduct a focus group of teachers, because I want more organic information about the changes they produced in their classrooms. I want to get their reflections on it, and a little bit of interplay back and forth with the teachers helps. Finally, I spend about 3 months analyzing and presenting the data and the information in a way that will be valuable and useful for the superintendent, the parents, and the principals. And I'm hoping that the principals will share the information with their teachers, because in this case, this is going to be used for making decisions and policy. So you can see that it's a lengthy process for something that sounds so simple up front. Now let me talk to you a little bit about sampling. How does a qualitative researcher choose who they're going to study and who's best going to represent what they want to find out? Well, sampling is incredibly important in qualitative research because it has to be very purposeful. The researcher has to, a convenient sample just isn't a good idea. But you'll see this in so much of the qualitative research. Sad but true. The researcher will use a third grade classroom because they knew the teacher, because the principal would let them come in and do this, because the parents would sign the consent forms, all of these things. And that's not as powerful in the research world as when a researcher very carefully thinks through and eliminates and narrows down to what's going to be the best sample. Now, in some research questions or problems or settings, the researcher is going to want the maximum variation that they can get in their sample, because they may want the low end and the high end and everything in between to represent the differences and be able to describe this natural interplay between those. Sometimes it's really valuable when you're looking for maximum variation to be looking for the really one extreme and the other extreme and compare those back and forth, and that can be really powerful too. Sometimes, though, the research question lends itself more to using unique cases. And in that case, I want the extremes, or I want their uniqueness. And here's some examples of what I mean by that. I may want to be looking at the extremes in a classroom. I may be looking at the give and take and flow of the classroom, but what happens when you have an autistic child in that classroom, or a child who maybe not autistic, or autistic and incredibly brilliant, and what that does to the classroom and how that child reacts in the classroom. Or I may want unique cases and study one or two children just because they are simply typical and representative of that classroom. Or I may be looking at a child who's very unique in that setting. It could deal with a reputation or a critical case. It may be really, really important to find out how a student who's of a very unusual in that class setting ethnic group, and how that child fits in with the flow. I was observing a classroom a little while ago that was there was one African American girl in the entire class. Everyone else in the class was what I would call white or Hispanic, and as I was making my notes, this one girl stood out because of her uniqueness that way. And there were some things I noticed in that classroom as the other children interacted with her that were very valuable to describe and pull out. There may be unique cases that I'm looking for because of the conceptual or the theoretical framework that I'm using. All of this is determined by that research question and what I'm trying to find out. Now, sampling size doesn't have those rules of thumb that I talked about with quantitative data. There's no way that we can go to a textbook and come up with what the sampling size should be. It's based on the purpose of the research and the focus of the research. I've seen incredible things learned with a case study of one student that was really powerful. And case studies can be fascinating to read because they're like little historical novels of what the experience is of this one person or this one classroom in some cases. You always have data collection considerations such as availability when you're looking at your sampling size. Yes, it would be wonderful to interview all 35 fourth graders, but is it going to happen? No, it's not likely that you're going to be able, you'll go crazy, or you'll have to have too many interviewers, and it's just too much data to work with. So sampling becomes really important. Other than case studies, though, you do want some redundancy. Um, it's hard to, unless it's set up as a case study where you're following one person in so much depth. It's hard to have some credibility if you're not gathering data that overlaps a little bit. So you want to consider a minimum as you're going along. However, you also have to weigh that against the evasiveness of your research. Remember, you want this naturalistic and contextual, and so how much are you going to do, and how much are you going to impose yourself into the classroom? Validity takes on a new face in qualitative research. Validity still refers, of course, to how well the descriptions and the explanations and the interpretations relate to the real world. Is the researcher doing a good job of capturing information that really does echo or mirror the real world? And so there's always this congruence you're looking for between the explanation and the realities. But it falls on the researcher to make these connections for the research consumer. Um, in qualitative research, validity also refers to how well the interpretations of the researchers and the interpretations of the participants mesh. And that is very difficult to measure with the fundamental philosophy that each will interpret whatever they see differently. But a good researcher will consistently and systematically align all their interpretations and explanations with those of the participants, often discussing the findings with them. Many researchers share what they're seeing with the participants and ask them if are my interpretations close. So there are some ways that you can enhance the validity of a qualitative research, and you should look for these as you read your research articles, and look to see what the researcher has done to enhance the validity. First of all, there has to be, if it's going to be really, really valid, the person needs to be there enough. There needs to be enough field work or prolonged field work. There should be multiple data collection strategies. You're not just going to do classroom observations and that's it in most cases. You want to be able to triangulate what you see and see the patterns emerging from different strategies. It's really important, if you're going to have this validity, that you have verbatim accounts and quotes, and that you capture the participant language and report that back. It's also really important that the researcher doesn't make a bunch of inferences about what they saw. This girl crossed her arms across her chest and frowned is more, I feel that there's more validity in that than this child was upset or something like that, where I've made an inference from her body language. It's much better to describe what is seen as much as possible and then make the inferences from patterns or what you see, or at least let your audience know that you're now inferring that the child was upset, for example. Multiple researchers, multiple observers, multiple interviewers, and having these all reliably reporting the data lends a lot to the validity of the study. Recording, that should be recording, not recoding. I'm so sorry, but it should be recording. We have such incredible technology now that lets us capture exactly, and this goes back to the participant language and the verbatim accounts. If you're going to really, really enhance the validity of your study, a participant researcher is really, really valuable. And then I talked about member checking. This is where, at the end of the day, I've been doing some classroom observations. At the end of the day, I sit down and talk with the teacher and say, now this, and this is what I observed. Does that align? And I get some explanation for what I observed. That really, really helps to enhance the validity of my study.